as well. My name is Dave Apsley. I'm a natural resource specialist with Ohio State University Extension, and I coordinate our Day in the Woods program. So I want to just introduce you a little bit to Day in the Woods, because I think we have a lot of folks on who may not be familiar with it. But today's program is Migratory Birds, and we've got Steve Matthews, Matt Shumar, and Brad Perkins leading the presentations. Day in the Woods is a program that we developed in Southeast Ohio to reach out to woodland owners. And this is just a slide that shows all of our partners, or most of our partners. Depending on how you define partner, we have lots and lots of folks that have helped us over the years. We've probably had 100 different presenters plus over the years with Day in the Woods programming. We have a web page. You can go to this site if you would like, and you can subscribe, and then you'll get updates on our upcoming programs. This is our tentative agenda for the remainder of 2021. We're kind of in that limbo mode with COVID. We don't know when the doors are going to open up. So we're going to be virtual for the foreseeable future. And then once we get the certainty that we can open up to go more live, we're hoping to be able to do things in a hybrid mode where we can still broadcast as much as we can. Although many of the sites we use are pretty limited in internet capabilities. So we'll see what we can do. Our next program is May 14th, and we've got Gerald Bartik, Kubler. They're going to do forest ecology. Gerald's going to talk a bit about forest health, or human health, and the tie to forest and forest ecology. And then Lisa's going to talk about your ecological zip code and where we fit in this, in the whole realm of forest ecology. And then you can see the other programs we've got scheduled for the year. Also wanted to remind folks, we got lots of videos, chainsaw videos that Brad's helped with, and the folks at Hawking. We've got lots of recordings from our previous Day in the Woods programs. This one will also be posted, so we get that question a lot. And then finally, our tree ID videos, we're up to about 44. We had one a week. I don't know what we're doing next week, but I'm thinking about redbud possibly. And the one we did this past week was serviceberry. And we're also on Facebook, so when we do launch those videos on Tremendous Tuesdays, you can seek us out under Southeast Ohio Woods, SE Ohio Woods. We've also got lots of good resources in partnership with the Woodland Stewards Program. Marnie's been helping with a lot of our programming lately. And then there's my contact. So I'd like to start out with a poll. See if anybody's starting to see that poll and can give us some feedback. So we're asking, what's your favorite migratory bird? I'm just curious if folks, and don't get stressed out if you can't find or figure out how to do the poll. You should be able to access it either way. Just kind of curious to get things going and see what folks are thinking this morning. And that'll also allow more folks to join as we're working through this. I don't know why I'm fascinated by word clouds. So.
Well, we're definitely seeing some variety, Dave.
They're starting to come in.
I saw somebody just threw up red-headed woodpecker, which has always been one of my favorites.
Yeah, this has been a great year for that bird with the massive amount of mast out there.
Yes. Dave, does this poll do the sizing by the number of?
Yes. So the more it's entered, the bigger it gets. Yeah.
So Redwing Blackbird's leading the way. That's
interesting. I wonder about the Blackbirdian Warbler and if it has anything to do with the photo that we posted to advertise this program too.
Could have become some people's new favorite bird.
Favorite, yeah.
Definitely one of mine.
Okay, I think that's enough to get us started. I thought we'd do the same poll and I'll capture it for you guys just for interest to see if anything changes, if you maybe make somebody's favorite bird different after your presentation. So with that, Brad, I'm going to let you folks introduce yourself because I never do it justice. So I'm going to let Brad Perkins share his screen. And remember to click that little box, Brad, for your sharing your audio. And then we'll kick it off and let Brad introduce himself, and we'll also have Stephen and Matt do the same. Looks like we're up to 178 total, so.
Okay, so I'm Brad Perkins by day. I'm the executive director of the Ohio Forestry Association. But in evenings and weekends, I have a lot of other hobbies that I enjoy. And one of those is what I'll say birding or bird watching, particularly like getting out and identifying all the different birds that we have access to here in Ohio and other states. And I also, 15, 20 years ago, started dabbling in a little outdoor photography. So a lot of bird and wildlife and other outdoor photography. So I'm still an amateur at that, but hopefully you'll enjoy the pictures that we'll see today here. Steve and Matt, if you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves before I start on the screen here.
Sure. My name is Matt Shumar. I'm program coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. And this is a consortium of about 120 organizations throughout Ohio and regionally, working on large-scale bird conservation planning. And I'm based in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at OSU.
And hi everyone. So I'm Steve Matthews. Like Matt, I'm in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State, and also affiliation with the Forest Service Northern Research Station. So I'm associate professor there in the School of Environment, Natural Resources, and Wildlife Landscape Ecology. And looking forward to the day.
Brad, let me share one more thing too, just for protocol for today. We're on Zoom webinar, so we've got a couple ways we can get people to participate, but with 180 people on, we can't have everybody's mics and cameras on. So we really recommend, if you have questions for Brad, Steve, or Matt, to put them in the Q&A section, and then we'll monitor that. And some of the questions we'll try to take live if they fit the timing. Others will stay on and answer your questions at the end. So use the Q&A. And then if you have questions or problems with the technology and you just want to ask us, a question about how to do that, you can use the chat window for that. And I'll also stick my cell phone number in there. You can text me if you're having other difficulties and that's not working. So sorry about that interruption, guys. Take it away.
No, that's great. So, what today's presentation is all about really is migration. And Steve and Matt are the experts on this stuff. I'm going to talk more about just some identification of some of our migrants, but we are in that time of year where a lot of our birds are migrating right now. Most of them are migrating north up into our area. So the birds that left last fall are starting to come back. Now my wife loves this time of year because she thinks all the beautiful birds are on their way back. And of course, I also like the winter time because we see birds that are migrating south from the Arctic actually come into Ohio. So we get to see a whole different arena of birds during the winter time that we wouldn't see otherwise. Plus, there's no leaves on the trees at that point in time, so they're easier to see. So we really have some different migrations with different seasons. But now we've got a lot of the most colorful birds are starting to come back into Ohio. And today I'm specifically going to talk about one of those groups of birds, and that's what we call the warblers. And the warblers are really, very, very small birds. Other than the hummingbirds, the warblers are about as small as we get. So all of these birds, from a size standpoint, their total length, including their tails, are 4 to 6 inches in length. All of them weigh less than an ounce, and most of them weigh less than a half an ounce. So we're talking really small birds. So, when you're thinking about that, they can be very hard to see. So, for identification purposes, there's some tools we need to have at our disposal that really can help us out here. So I like to have a good birding guide around at all times. Now I'm showing a couple different ones here. One, the Kaufman Field Guide there, and there's a lot of good field guides, and these are, to all North American birds, but the warblers are included in there. But then oftentimes there are specific guides for different groups of birds. So I also have then a field guide to warblers, which is just the warblers. Now there's differences in all these books. For instance, the Stokes Field Guide here actually uses photographs, pictures of the birds for identification, whereas some of the other books use artistic drawings with all the coloration stuff. But in any case, having a good field guide is great for identification. The other thing that you're probably going to need is a set of binoculars. Okay, and so I travel with a decent pair of binoculars and a camera most of the time, which is how I get a lot of the pictures. Here's a sample of what I use, and you'll see that that's not one of the big, huge professional cameras that you'll see guys out with. It's got you know, a 2-foot long lens on it and a big, huge camera. This is a small point and shoot super zoom camera. Several different companies make them, but it's light enough I can carry it around with me in the woods. And when we're talking about the warblers, if you don't have binoculars, or you know, you're not going to see them, or if you do see them, you're not going to be able to identify and see the beautiful colors and stuff on them. So highly recommend buying a decent pair of binoculars if you really want to get into birding. And you know, you can buy, you know, good, you know, ones that'll work for $100 to $200. You can buy really nice ones for $300 to $500. You know, this pair is about $1,000 pair. It's the first pair I've bought in 25 years. Very nice. Or if you've got the funding, Swarovski will sell you some $2,500 to $3,000 binoculars. But really, just any binoculars are going to help you out a lot when it comes to bird identification. So with that, you know, one of the other things that I don't want to forget to mention here is, you know, not only the coloration and the view of the birds, but also the sounds. So I will incorporate a few sounds into our presentation today, just some of the more unique calls that some of these little warblers have. But again, there are ways to get this stuff really easily. So there are a lot of birding apps out there for your smartphones that can not only have the visual identification stuff, but also the bird calls. I have a Sibley's app on mine, so that helps me with identification in a lot of ways, but I can play the call of every warbler out there, so I can hear it, I can get used to it and listen to it, so that when I hear something out in the woods, I'll know what I'm, you know, possibly listening to. And so thinking about finding warblers in Ohio, we mentioned they're starting to migrate in. Where are some of the best places to look for these birds? So right off the bat, I think of the Lake Erie shoreline, the Western Lake Erie Basin. Here in about another month, usually, you know, even really starting in early to mid-May, a lot of these warblers are making their way up into Canada, up into the Arctic, and they just flock to that Lake Erie shoreline and stop and feed up before they fly across Lake Erie. So any of the marshes up in that area, any of the woodlots, anywhere from Sandusky to Toledo is a great place for warblers. But also Southern Ohio, where they actually hit there earlier as they're migrating up from the south. And so Matt and Steve will explain some of those migratory routes and stuff when they discuss this later. But a lot of the forested state parks and stuff in the south, Shawnee, Zaleski, those places are a great place to see a lot of the warblers, especially in some of the clear-cut areas down there that were harvested and are growing back with a lot of vigorous young wooded growth that just have, you know, tons of food source for these warblers. So, but they can be seen anywhere. So, you know, keep your eyes open for that. So I'm going to get started here, and I'm going to start with what I'm going to call, you know, one of the main categories of our warblers is, it seems like the color yellow is the most dominant color in our warblers. And so we're going to start off with the warblers that either have yellow in the name or predominantly yellow in the color. So this first one here is a male yellow warbler. Beautiful warbler. This is a, you know, very small bird. They're bright yellow, and the males have the nice auburn red streaking on them. See these a lot around the marshes. In fact, if I go up into that Lake Erie area in that mid-May time, it seems like the two most common birds there are going to be the yellow warbler and the Redwing Blackbird are the two most common birds up there. And a few of these warblers I also will show of the female coloration if I've got pictures of that. And you know, I don't have of all of them, but here is a female yellow warbler. Now you can see it's still an all yellow bird, but it doesn't have that auburn streaking on the chest. But you often see these guys, you know, they hang out together, obviously. And one of the things we will see with a lot of the female warblers, and this is true of some other species of our birds too, is that they are a much more drab color. They don't have all the bright coloration that a lot of the male warblers do. And I think there's a couple ways of thinking about that. I think predominant thinking is that the females are a lot more drab color in these smaller birds so that they are camouflaged when they're on their nests. So they can't be found by predators nearly as often. Also makes identification harder. You see a lot of female warblers that look so much alike that you really have to be good at your ID to tell what they are. So these are the yellow warbler. We'll move on here to one here. This is the yellow-throated warbler. And most of my photography and stuff is actually taken out in the woods, that kind of thing. But I want to show you, you don't always have to go out there to find the birds. So this is a yellow warbler on one of my bird feeders at home. We've actually had a yellow-throated warbler that has been nesting there on our property this will make 6 years. And he just showed up this morning. First time I was out feeding the bird feeders this morning, and he was calling from his normal tree that he likes to call from. So you don't always have to actually go out in the woods to find these things. Sometimes they're right there in your backyard. And so the yellow-throated warbler, kind of a blue-gray bird, a lot of black streaking and that bright yellow throat. Now, oftentimes these birds, if they're not on your feeder, they're up very high in the tree. So a lot of times when you're looking up, all you see is that kind of white belly and yellow throat. But again, one of the beautiful yellow-throated warbler. Here's the common yellow throat. And boy, that name yellow is in so many of these, you have to kind of figure out which ones are which. And the common yellow throat, one of our smaller little warblers, and they like brushy, thickety areas, so they can be really hard to see. Now, but this is one of those that has a very distinctive call, and I'll play that for you, which oftentimes makes it a lot easier to find him because you'll hear him, and then it gives you a chance to locate him. But the bright yellow with that black bandit type face mask, here's what they sound like. So we often think about that as saying witchety, witchety, witchety. And there's another bird, the Carolina wren can sound like that a little bit at times, but that distinct witchety, witchety, witchety is usually going to be the common yellow throat. And there's another look at him and said he looks like a little bandit, almost like he's got a raccoon face on him. Next one here, we're going to go from one of our smallest up to our largest warbler, which is the yellow-breasted chat. The yellow-breasted chat the male has a solid bright yellow chest and belly area, dark on the back, got that white markings up around the face, and also the largest bill of any of our warblers, has a very large beak. And Matt can probably help me on this one just for a second. And that is, I think recently, most of our warblers here in Ohio are considered wood warblers, but I think the yellow-breasted chat may have recently been given its own designation. Is that correct, Matt?
Yes, that was long overdue. The chat is not a warbler.
Okay. So they finally said it's no longer a warbler, and they're taking it out of there.
Yeah, they're their own thing.
Okay, great, thanks. I thought I had just read that. So we'll strike him from our presentation the next time. But they're a very interesting little bird. Again, they're very secretive. They live out in the brushy areas. I find this a lot in some of the old reclaimed strip mine ground on some of the wildlife areas. I'm going to play his call too because it's got several different variations within the call, but very distinct. Again, these guys, love to stay hidden. This picture shows the size of that beak, quite large compared to the rest of the warblers. But when I say large, this bird still only weighs 1 ounce, so we're still talking quite small. Moving on to another one. This is the yellow rumped warbler, and in this one, this is the yellow rump. This is a male. You can see the yellow on the rump of it, but it's a little bit whited out here in this picture. But they also, as you can see here, he has a little bit of a yellow spot on his head and some yellow on his shoulders. I'm going to show another picture here showing the front of him quite a bit better here. And again, you can see the shoulder patches. Now, in the yellow rump warbler, there's actually two variants or subspecies that we'll call this. One that we see here in the east is called the myrtle. And then there's another one that's more out west, which is called the Audubons. And the difference, the visual difference you would see right away on that is the Audubons has more of a yellow throat instead of the white throat that we have here. Now, occasionally an Audubons is seen here in Ohio. I have not seen one here in Ohio. I did take some pictures of one out west earlier this past year. I was fortunate enough to see some out there. But all the pictures I've included here in our presentation today are pictures of birds that I've taken here in Ohio. Again, it's the yellow rump warbler. This is one of our more common warblers. It's usually the first ones that come back here in the spring. I started seeing them here this past weekend, and they're also usually one of the last ones to leave. So again, this is the yellow rump, and this is our myrtle variety here. Now, one of the most beautiful ones we have is the Prothonotary Warbler, and they're a bright orange yellow with the dark gray wings. They like to live around water, so I find them, below my house as part of the Dillon Wildlife Area. There's some ponds and some streams there, and there's some brushy, shrubby stuff around these ponds, which is where they like to live. They're also a nesting or a cavity nester, so they're one of those birds that will actually nest in old woodpecker holes in those kind of areas. And I've seen places where some people actually put out box nests for these warblers in those kind of marshy, swampy areas. Now, they have a very distinct call also, although it's not as variant as like the one we just heard from the yellow-breasted chap. But again, it stands out, so they're in the area. So with a lot of these warblers, I hear them before I ever see them. But if I hear that sound, then I know what to start looking for. And it's like that with most of the warblers. So again, I would highly recommend getting an app where you can actually get those sounds and listen to them, because it's a great way to help you find them when you're out in the woods. There's just another picture here of the Prothonotary, just the most beautiful orange yellow color. Now, I want you to notice, though, where the beak is and the eye, that there's no black connecting between the beak and the eye, because the next warbler we're going to look at looks very similar to this in coloration in the wings. And this is the blue-winged warbler. But the two differences you see real quickly there is that the blue-winged warbler has that black stripe that runs from the beak to the eye, but it also has some white stripes on its wings. But if I go back again real quickly, you can see the Prothonotary doesn't have the white wing bars, and it doesn't have that black stripe up there by the eye. So, very quick and easy way to distinguish between the blue-winged warbler, which also has one of the most distinctive calls. So there's just no mistaking that that buzz type sound. So again, if I hear this guy, I start looking for him. And again, I find these in more the brushy, not the big tall trees and stuff, but more the brushy habitat. There's another picture of one with dinner in his mouth or in his beak. Got him a nice little worm there. But again, very distinctive with that black eye stripe and the wing bars. Moving on to one of our more woodland warblers, the Hooded Warbler. And he's basically, again, yellow, still our predominant color, with that full black face mask around the top of the head and around the throat area. Kind of the opposite of the common yellow throat that had the black right across the eye and forehead. And again, this is one that we find more in the deeper woods. I'll play the call on this one too. And again, because we see these more in the deeper woods, as things start to leaf out, you usually hear these birds way before you ever see them. So again, if you learn that call, then I can start looking around for him and find him hopping through the trees. Beautiful bird, one of my favorite of the warblers. And here's another shot of him. I put this one in there basically though to show you what anybody who tries to do bird photography has to put up with. There's always a stick or a blade of grass or a twig or a leaf right in front of that perfect shot. So again, this would have been a great picture had that one little twig not been there, but it still shows the coloration, the greenish color on the back, and the beautiful yellow face and the black mask around the head. Continuing with our yellow colored warblers, this is the Kentucky Warbler, one of our slightly larger warblers, but also one of our more secretive warblers. It took me years to really get some good views of the Kentucky Warbler. I had seen one briefly for like 2 seconds up around Marblehead Lighthouse area back several years ago. And finally, in Black Cane Gorge State Nature Preserve, close to my house, was able to locate a couple last year, and obviously got some really nice photos of the Kentucky Warbler. But they're more low brush and ground dwelling type warblers, where you normally see them very, very low in the canopy. And so you'll see them around old logs and blowdowns and that type of thing. And so again, you'll hear them before you ever see them. Now, later on in the program here, I'm going to play a sound of another bird that can be somewhat similar to that, but I'll describe the difference when we get there. But this is one of my favorites, but it took me a long time to get him. My wife and I spent several years trying to really get some good looks at the Kentucky Warbler. Now, this is my wife's favorite, the Canada Warbler. And again, this is one of those that's very secretive. So when you do get that opportunity, they're usually behind stuff. They don't come out in the open a whole lot. It's a very dark, almost gunmetal gray on the back, kind of a blue gray, all solid yellow on the front, but they've got that beautiful necklace, black necklace on the front. There's a couple of our warblers that have kind of a necklace on there, and the Canada Warbler is one of those. And that's really, one of the easiest ways to identify it compared to all the other warblers that have that solid yellow chest, is if it's got that necklace around there, that's a male Canada Warbler. And again, continuing with yellow, the Wilson's Warbler. Beautiful little bird, mostly yellow, a lot of greenish yellow on the back and some brownish on the wings, but they've got that very distinct little black beanie cap. And so that makes them very, very easy to identify. It's the only one we've got that's got that much yellow and that just solid black. This one here's got a little kind of a puffed up hairdo on him, but one of our most beautiful little warblers. This is the Wilson's Warbler. Well, let me go back. One other thing about the Wilson's Warbler, you can almost see it in this picture. If you look really closely at the eye, you can see that there's a ring just inside the eye there, of little white dots around the eye there. So this is another identifying characteristic of the Wilson's Warbler. Obviously, got to be really close with binoculars or a good camera to see that, but it is a good identifying characteristic. Another yellow one here, the Prairie Warbler. So the Prairie Warbler, due to, as fitting with its name, the Prairie Warbler, I normally find this one out in more grassy, shrubby territory. So when I think of the Woodbury Wildlife Area, the Tri-Valley Wildlife Area, any of these places that were old strip mines that were reclaimed, still have a lot of grasslands, a lot of shrublands. This is where I often find the Prairie Warbler. And they like to sit on the top of a small bush or a small tree and sing. And I'll play their sound for you too, because I think it's very distinctive. So that Prairie Warbler call is very distinctive. It always starts off low and very shrill, but goes up, ending up on high notes, but very distinctive. None of the other ones sound quite like that at all. So I can be driving very slow in my truck out in the wildlife area there, and I can hear that from 100 yards away and start trying to locate him. Again, this is the Prairie Warbler. Here's another shot of the Prairie Warbler. Almost got him sitting right in the beautiful pink and white flowers there, but one of these days. Now we're starting to get, still some yellow of these, but we're going to start getting into some other colors of our warblers here. This is the Cape May Warbler. A lot more orange versus yellow, but a lot of black streaking on it. And one of the other identifying characteristics is that kind of a reddish auburn cheek patch. And that's the real identifying characteristic here for the male Cape May Warbler. I think I have a second shot here. So this one really shows the cheek patch there, and also kind of that black hairdo, kind of like we saw with the Wilson's Warbler earlier, but that real black streaking on the kind of yellow or yellow orange chest. And this is our Cape May Warbler. Now, when I see them, they're usually higher up in the tree canopy, not clear to the top, but not down low like some of the ones we talked about earlier. Still with yellow being predominant here, our Magnolia Warbler, very, very beautiful little bird. Gray and black and yellow are the dominant colors here. Got some white wing bars. Those long black streaks on the yellow chest, and the black on the eye line is very, very common. Here's another shot of the Magnolia Warbler. You see a little bit of green on the back shoulders that can identify that, but that yellow with the big black, heavy black streaking and the black across the face really sets the Magnolia Warbler apart. Another yellow one, the Pine Warbler. And this guy I don't get to see very often. They're one of the early ones back to Ohio too. It's just a very drab, almost all yellow bird. A little bit of green on the back, so a little bit of white barring on the wings, but otherwise just mostly that kind of greenish yellow. I do find those a lot in some of the big white pine stands. I don't have his call on here, but once you learn his call, you can hear that and start looking for him. But again, they're oftentimes up higher, except maybe when they're migrating, you'll see them down lower a little bit, but normally they're up very high in the canopy of the pine trees. And another one with still a little bit of yellow is our Palm Warbler. So the Palm Warbler is more brownish and light tannish yellow, but it's got that red head cap. And another real identifying characteristic of the Palm Warbler is it almost constantly pumps its tail up and down. So if you see a bird sitting on a low branch or even on the ground, these feed on the ground quite a bit. So as you can see here, I've got him. He was on a roadway down in the Dillon Wildlife area, and so if this was video, you would see him constantly pumping his tail up and down. But in our area, I know we see the Palm Warblers coming in flocks, and we'll have large groups of them just all in the trees. So I normally see them very, very low level in the bushes and trees or on the ground. This is the Palm Warbler. And we're still with the yellow. We'll get out of it here in a little bit, but this is the Nashville Warbler. And my wife keeps getting confused because we have a Nashville Warbler and we have a Tennessee Warbler. I'll show the difference. There's quite a bit of difference, but the Nashville Warbler, mostly yellow with a gray helmet. So it almost looks like a motorcycle helmet. It's open in the face around the beak. The gray takes the top, sides, and back of the head. Also on this one, you can see it's got just a little bit of red showing on the top head feathers. And some of our warblers and a lot of our other smaller birds often get this kind of reddish glow there. And I'm not sure, I think it has maybe to do a little bit with either the mating or with if they're disturbed, that type of thing. Again, Matt or Steve, can you guys add any comments to that about because we see this sometimes in the Prothonotary, the kinglets and like this.
Yeah, sure. So the red on the head, is that what you're asking
Yeah.
about? Yeah, for the Nashville Warbler, that is the breeding plumage in males. So females don't have that. It's unique. It's not that visible usually.
Right.
You've done a great job of photographing it here. And we did have a question about the Prothonotary Warbler as well. And the red was really exacerbated in that photo that you had.
Mhm.
Males do have a little bit richer color on the head, but that's more likely that that individual was that red because of the tannins in the tree cavity in the water, because they're going in and out of tree cavities. You can see this in downy woodpeckers and other woodpeckers. You know, their white feathers get stained sort of reddish tan from those tree tannins.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. So again, this is the Nashville Warbler. Now moving on, we go to another one that's got yellow, and I apologize for the picture here, but I have only seen 2 mourning warblers, and the one I didn't get any pictures of. This one is a very secretive bird. They're relatively rare here in Ohio. It's got a very dark gray head cap, as opposed to the light gray we just saw on the Nashville Warbler. But these are real solitary. So where you usually see these are around blowdowns and old logs on the ground. Sometimes around water, but not always. But these guys just stay hidden. They're very hard to see. Just occasionally they'll jump up, eat a little bit, and go right back into hiding. So the mourning warbler is one of those that I try to find when I can and try to get some better pictures of. Wish I had a better one to show you on this. And there's another warbler here that comes through Ohio that I don't have a picture of, and there's only 2 that I don't have. One is the Connecticut Warbler. The Connecticut Warbler is very similar to the mourning warbler in appearance, as far as the dark head and the kind of greenish yellow back, but it has a very distinctive white eye ring, and I don't have a picture of it yet to show that.
Yeah, Brad, if you want good photos of the mourning warbler, they're more of a higher elevation and northern latitude species. So you actually see my background behind me. This is the Monongahela National Forest. And at some of those higher elevation sites on the Monongahela, especially in clear cuts, mourning warblers are fairly abundant and sing like crazy. But you have to get up to some of those higher spots.
Okay.
High elevation.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I need to do that. I said I've only been fortunate to see 2 of them so far. Now here's one of our most beautiful warblers, the northern Perula. Of course, I hear that word Perula pronounced 3 or 4 different ways, so I'm not sure if I'm doing it right or not. I hear Perula. So anyway, this is really pretty. They're kind of a blue-gray bird, a little bit of reddish orange yellow on the chest, a little bit there under the throat. Got another, oh, sorry about that. This one's got the sound. And you hear he's got 2 or 3 different types of calls, but this is one of those birds that usually is at high elevation within the tree canopy. They like to stay up there, so it's one of those you're going to hear usually before you see. Occasionally during the migrations, when you're up around the Lake Erie marshes and stuff, they flock so many birds together that they're in some of those low shrubbery and stuff, and you get some good looks at them. But otherwise, they're normally up high in the tree. So you're going to have to identify them by sound normally before you can even start looking for them to see them. Here's another picture of the northern Perula. Really pretty bird. I recall the first time I ever saw one, I was actually at the White Oak Inn helping with a nature weekend up in Coshocton County, and we were sitting outside on a porch, and all of a sudden we could hear something pecking on a window, and we look up, and here's this little bird sitting on a windowsill, pecking on a window of this lodge we were at. And I'm like, holy cow, I don't recognize that. Got the binoculars out. Here it was the first northern Perula that I was fortunate enough to see. But for whatever reason, he was seeing his shadow, or his reflection, I should say, in that window, and was apparently trying to drive that other male Perula out of the territory. But very beautiful bird, but usually very high up in the canopy. So you almost have to hear him before you see him. So now we're getting away from the all yellow birds. This is the American redstart. This is a male American redstart, very dark black with the bright orange shoulder, bright orange wing bars. This is more of a wooded habitat bird, beautiful bird. And my next picture here, I thought I had a picture of a female here. The female redstart, looks very similar to this, but Matt was able to point this out to me the other day because the black streaking or black blotching you see there on the front of the chest actually indicates that this is a young immature male. If it didn't have that, the female looks, quite similar to this. And I think, one of the prettier of our non-male plumage birds. And I've got a second picture here of another immature male that's a little further along in his, feather molting here, where he's actually got a lot more of the tail feather coloring that the adult male will have. And he's got more of a solid black line up there by the shoulder, by the orange, instead of this one here, which just had more blotching on the front. But apparently that black coloration there on the front of it, there is the indicator here that these are young immature males and not the females. Now another beautiful one here, the chestnut-sided warbler, has the yellow head cap, multicolored back. A lot of what we've seen before are a solid color on the back. This one is multicolored back, a lot of like brown, green, and off yellow, but it's got that black on the face, the white cheek patch, and that chestnut coloration down the side. Again, one of our small warblers, very, very beautiful color there. I got a second picture of it here, shows that chestnut stripe down the side of it very, very plainly here. Now here's one of my favorites, the black-throated blue warbler, and a couple unique things about the black-throated blue. Obviously, it's a very blue, back on this bird, the very dark black throat, some black down the sides, but the little white, almost like square-looking thing on its wing really gives you a really good identifying characteristic, whether you're looking at a male or a female. They all have that little squarish white patch on the wing. But another interesting thing about the black-throated blue warbler, let's take a look at this picture. Doesn't look blue, right? So it looks more like a black-throated black warbler, right? So one of the things in nature is most birds with blue feathers, we think about the indigo bunting, the blue jay, a lot of these birds and the black-throated blue warbler is, the blue color isn't necessarily a natural color in nature. So the way the feathers are is the sun has to refract through the feathers, which are black, in order to produce that blue color. So this guy was obviously sitting in the sun. So the sun was refracting through those blue feathers to make the blue color show up. But in this one, he was in the shade. So you see none of the blue. It just looks black. But again, you see that white wing bar that's it looks more square when you're looking at it from a distance or through binoculars. Very quick identifying characteristic here. Another unique bird in the warbler category is the black and white warbler. And it is all black and white. It's the only two colors on it. It's all streaked. I'll show another picture of it here. But one of the unique things about the black and white warbler is, if any of you know what our nuthatches are, our red-breasted nuthatches, our white-breasted nuthatches, they can actually walk upside down a tree. So they can go up and down. And the black and white warbler is one of the few birds that also does that. So, the first time I saw one of these, I actually thought it was a nuthatch until I got the binoculars on it, but I knew the coloration didn't look right. So if you see a little black and white bird like this that's walking up the tree, then down the tree, that's one of the few birds that can do that. And it's the only warbler that I've seen that does that. And I believe this might have been one of the pictures that Dave had on the front of the program here, but the Blackburnian warbler, beautiful warbler here, that bright orange throat, the black and yellow head pattern and the white chest, or white belly, I should say. Interesting thing about these birds is I was really fortunate here in it. I got to take pictures of some of these at eye level. You almost never see these at eye level. you are normally looking straight up at them and above you, and all you see is the white belly and the orange throat. You don't get to see the head color, you don't get to see the back color, but they're very, very beautiful warbler. It's the Blackburnian warbler, but this is a view that you very seldom get. Now we had the black-throated blue warbler a little bit ago. This is the black-throated green. Obviously the black throat, very distinctive, just like on the black-throated blue warbler. I'm going to play the sound on this one too, because again, this is one of those distinct calls that if you hear this one, you're not going to mistake it. So, you know, when I hear that one in the woods, immediately know I'm looking for a black-throated green warbler. Here's another picture that really shows the greenish color on the head and the back with that black throat. And sometimes when we're up in McGee Marsh on Lake Erie in May, these things can just be dripping from the trees. They can be right there. You know, you can almost reach out and touch them. But a very beautiful little bird, the black-throated green warbler. Now here's another one that doesn't have any of that yellow. This is the blackpoll warbler, named for that. You know, got that just a black on the top of his head. The rest of him is, you know, white, gray, a little bit of brown on the wings, but also the bright orange legs. Well, you see those again here. Not all the warblers have those kind of bright orange legs and feet there. Here he is in some willows, but the black head really stands out. Again, you see on the back here, gray, black streaking, a little bit of brown. This is the blackpoll warbler. Another one here, the Bay Breasted Warbler. And again, I hope you guys are seeing that all of these things look different. You know, each of these birds looks, you know, identifiably different. A couple of them are close, especially in the yellow ones, but you know, this Bay Breasted, although it still has that kind of streak, almost like the chestnut-sided warbler we looked at earlier, the rest of the body is completely different, with the bay coloring up on the top of the head, whereas the chestnut-sided had bright yellow up there. So they obviously can be identified very easily just by noticing those few differences. So we had the Nashville Warbler earlier. This is the Tennessee Warbler. So when I see a Tennessee Warbler, I have to really look at him closely, because my first thought is, am I looking at a red-eyed vireo? Because it's that same kind of grayish coloration with a little bit of green on the back of the shoulders there. But the red-eyed vireo, which is not a warbler, has eye stripe and stuff, black and white stripes up around the face and the eye, which this Tennessee warbler does not have. So it's really an almost all gray warbler with a little bit of that greenish yellow on the back and tail area, but very different from the Nashville Warbler. Now, one of the hardest ones for me to identify here is the orange crowned warbler. In this picture, I mean, because it's overall just a very drab, brownish, greenish, yellowish, grayish bird with a little bit of orange on the crown there, you can see in this picture. But this is a real hard one for me to identify. I have to either get a picture of it where I can look at it really closely, or have another bird professional there that goes, yeah, we're looking at an orange crowned warbler. Because otherwise they're just very plain looking little warbler. Okay, so moving into some of the more rare warblers that we have that come through Ohio here. So this one is the cerulean. And let me back up one second, I guess, and say, you know, we have basically 36 different species of warblers that normally pass through Ohio or live here in Ohio. Some of them pass through just going up into the northern latitudes of Canada and the Arctic to breed, but the number's 20 something. I'm sure that Matt and Steve will help us out with that here a little later. How many of them actually breed here in Ohio? But this is the cerulean, and it's one of our more rare, and it's normally in the upper treetops, and it looks kind of gray and white from here. But in fact, if I could get this one in some sunlight where you can see the back, it's got a beautiful bluish bluish feathering on the back and the wings, but it also has a very thin necklace right around the neck. You can barely see it in this picture, but it's got a real thin necklace of that kind of blue-gray around the neck too. So this is one that if we could get it down low enough where we could see it, it's really beautiful. I will play the sound here for this one too. Now, I've had some people tell me that sound is kind of like somebody trying to start up a lawnmower or a chainsaw or something, where it kind of has to start off slow and then takes off. So that's, sometimes trying to distinguish between that and a northern Perula, because they're both up in the treetops and their sounds kind of go up. That's one of the ways I kind of can help determine the difference there. Is it kind of sounds like an engine sputtering to take off and eventually gets going. Another one of the rare birds that comes through Ohio, the rare warblers, is the Kirtland's Warbler. And I have a male and female picture of this one. And the Kirtland Warbler is a bird that really specializes in where it breeds, and that is in the jack pine stands up in Michigan. So that's the only place that it breeds. So it's been on the decline, as we don't have as much jack pine as we used to have up in Michigan. So this bird is on the decline. From an identification standpoint, it's very dark colored on the back. It's got that yellow that extends from the throat, really from the beak all the way down the chest, with a little bit of striping in it. But it's also got a broken white eye ring around the eye. It's not a full white eye ring like a lot of birds have. It's a broken eye ring. And here's a picture of the female. You can still see that kind of broken eye ring, but it doesn't have as much of the black streaking on the front of it. Matt, can you add anything about the specifics of this with the jack pine habitat that it likes?
I mean, it's a very specific breeding habitat that's found in one place. This species was fairly abundant at one time. One of the issues that they had to deal with was the expansion of brown-headed cowbirds. And so there was a lot of brown-headed cowbird management in this area just to get that population back up. But they've had a lot of conservation success, and Kirtland's Warbler population is expanding really nicely. So we're seeing a lot of great success with this species and managing that habitat, which I believe undergoes periodic fire.
Yeah, yes, the importance of the young jack pine stands of less than 10 years is really critical, because their nests are in the ground, right? So those branches kind of bending over. So it's this combination of fire, both in terms of jack pine regeneration, but also this mosaic of really young jack pine stands. Mm-hmm. And so it's been this combination of forest management, control for brown-headed cowbirds, but also it's kind of the story of today and migration. They have a really tight kind of breeding and wintering range. And so there's kind of the importance of the habitats and pampas and breeding jack pine areas, right? And it's just really some really interesting research about connecting that full annual cycle has come out as we start to understand that populations come back through a lot of these intensive forest management efforts. And I will also just add, so Kirtland is a good example of a species, coming through Ohio, and you had cerulean there. And I just because this is typically held at Inverness and Day in the Woods, but that's where a lot of the breeding research on cerulean warblers has occurred over the years. And so this understanding of importance of shelter woods, harvest, and other aspects in terms of benefiting cerulean warblers, so important global continental kind of breeding grounds here in Ohio.
Great, thanks guys, I appreciate it. Got a couple more here I'm going to pull you in on too. But I feel really fortunate to have been able to see the Kirtlands 2 or 3 times. It's rare coming through Ohio, but always causes a stir amongst the birding community when somebody finds one that people can see and get pictures of. So another one that's that I'll ask these guys to weigh in on too is the golden winged warbler. I have a picture here of a female golden winged warbler, very beautiful. You see the gold on the wings, a little bit on the head, a little bit of black there on the face. The male is much more striking in coloration. I've only seen one male, and I did not, was not able to get pictures of it. But there's also some specific habitat issues with the golden wing warbler that I'd like those guys to weigh in on a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a lot to untangle with the species, and and trying to put this in just a few
Let's see you
brief
do it in
statements.
2 minutes. Let's see you do it in 2 minutes, Matt. Good luck.
Okay, so yeah, golden wing warbler. Well, first of all, that one of the major issues is hybridization, and their range is getting pushed from blue wing warbler. So there's actually a lot of research going on whether or not these are actually two separate species, and there's debate within the scientific community. At this point, they are considered two separate species. So there's breeding habitats, and there's also wintering habitat that Steve mentioned, that strong connectivity between winter ranges as well. So there's kind of two separate populations of golden wing warbler, an Appalachian population, and then one that's more upper Midwest boreal breeding. The Appalachian population is one that's doing very poorly, and we're seeing that disappear pretty rapidly. This species used to nest in Ohio throughout parts of the state. It's now functionally extirpated. There's one or two males on territory in any given year in the state of Ohio that we know about, one in southeastern Ohio, and there's one up in northwestern Ohio as well. So lots of conservation questions to answer with this species still, and there's a lot of research going on looking at migratory connectivity, wintering grounds and breeding grounds, and we still have a lot to learn, and hopefully enough time to answer some of those questions.
Just to add to that great explanation, a lot of efforts in terms of conservation funds to create the types of earlier successional habitats to support them. So there's been a lot of partnerships around that in other states. So, like Matt said, an intensive kind of research and kind of conservation partnerships to try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, they use those young regenerating forests, but very specific structural and species compositions within those. And so there's a lot of research trying to figure out what makes their early successional habitat preferences different than blue wing warbler, and what can we do to favor one over the other. And I don't know if that's been answered yet, or it can be answered in the near future.
And Matt, so you mentioned the early successional forest type, with the other dynamics you mentioned, but so thinking about here in Ohio, we've only got about 5% young successional forest right now, where we probably should have closer to 15%. Most of our forests are maturing more rapidly. So I guess that's part of the problem, is we don't have enough of that forest type to get to those very specific dynamics that they need for their breeding. Thanks again, guys.
Mm-hmm.
So couple here we'll be finishing up with. One here is the oven bird. Now this is very, very small. I believe it's still categorized in the warbler family. This is one of our ground birds. So I believe the oven bird name comes from the fact that it makes a ground nest out of mud and sticks and moss and stuff that they can tunnel into. It almost looks like a little ground oven. And that's where they nest, and that's where you normally see them on the ground. Kind of a greenish brown back. It's got that yellow with two brown stripes on the head and a very white chest with the black spots. I'm going to play his call though, because it's also distinctive. So one of the things to listen for in that call is it starts off very quiet and gets louder. And I know that probably was hard to hear on the computer, but when you're actually out in the woods and you hear this, it can sound a little bit like the Kentucky warbler. It can sound a little bit like a Carolina wren at times, but it always starts out very soft and gets louder at the end. So as soon as I hear that, it's a dead giveaway that we're talking about the oven bird. Two other birds that we don't always think about as being warblers, the Louisiana water thrush and the northern water thrush. I don't have great pictures of these. And there's a couple of differences. So this is the Louisiana water thrush. You can see it's mostly kind of a grayish brown, white chest, and some of that gray streaking on it, and the white eye line. I'm going to show a picture here of the northern water thrush. Again, apologize for I told you guys I was an amateur photographer, not a professional. But the differences here, you notice it's got a little bit more of a yellowish look to it, especially up there around that eye stripe. Going back to the Louisiana water thrush, it's more white. And this is a little bit more yellow and a little bit heavier streaking on the front. But there's also a big difference in their habitat areas. The northern water thrush likes non-moving water. They like to be around areas of, so let's say ponds, lakes, maybe marshes, that type of thing. Whereas the Louisiana water thrush really prefers moving water. So you'll normally find those in the woods around small moving streams. Very, very beautiful call. I don't have it on here. But again, it's one of those that they're hard to see in the woods because that's where they like, especially the Louisiana water thrush likes to live in the woods around the streams, but you can hear him very melodic call. And now we'll finish up here with a couple of rarities that are very seldom ever seen in Ohio. This is the Townsends Warbler. Took this picture a couple years ago up by Maumee Bay State Park out on the boardwalk there behind the lodge. It was in the evening, way up in the top of the tree, very little light, so I did not get a very good picture. But this was a Townsends Warbler. The only other one I've seen was out in Yosemite National Park in California. But so this bird was in that area. Here in Ohio, for whatever reason, we don't know. He got offline during his migration, but he showed up there. Some folks found him, and we were at least able to view him and got some recognizable pictures. But we're going to throw that picture up, throw it away because I need to get a better one. And we'll probably do the same with this Townsends Warbler, which is another rare warbler, and only got to see him back under the cover of these trees and just could not get a real good picture. But he also looks similar to, I think I mentioned earlier, there's only two of the warblers that are common coming through Ohio that I don't have pictures of. One was the Connecticut Warbler that we said looks a lot like the mourning warbler. The Townsends Warbler here actually looks a lot like the worm-eating warbler with that head, the striping pattern around the head and the beak and stuff, which I don't have a picture of the worm-eating warbler. But again, this is, very rare. It's the only one I've ever seen, and wish I could have gotten a better picture, but I didn't, so we're getting rid of it too. Last one on the list here, a Western Warbler, the Black-throated Gray Warbler. So earlier we had the black-throated green, we had the black-throated blue. This is the black-throated gray, and I've seen one of these in Ohio. Interesting thing about this one, when you're looking at him through the binoculars and stuff, is you see those white blobs up on the head, you see those bright yellow dots, and in either case you think you're looking at his eyes, but you're not. His eyes are very black and down below the, kind of in between the yellow and the white there. But when you see him, in person there, look through the binocular stuff, it almost looks like he's got yellow eyes, but that's just the little identifying marks on him there. But that's the black-throated gray. So hope you've enjoyed going through the warblers, one of our groups of migrating birds. There's a lot of birds migrating through right now. This is just one group of them. There's lots of other neotropical migrants and stuff. So hope you've enjoyed that. I know Steve and Matt are going to talk a lot more about migration, what's happening currently. And, I've released a couple of these other programs on birds. I think I've already done marsh birds and raptors, and I think Dave has links to those on his website. And I'm working on some of the others that we'll probably release here later this summer. So if you like other birds besides the warblers we've just gone through today, we may have some other stuff out there at a later date. So thanks. I guess if there's any questions about that about the birds before we turn it over to Matt and Steve.
We had a lot of really great questions come in while you were talking. Hopefully we got some of those answered, or all of those answered. But if folks have other questions for Brad while he's here.
There was one in the chat that it's back a ways from Mary. Do you see that, Matt, Mary Rosum, about trying to help a lady in Oak Harbor. Do you mind just doing that verbally, answering that one?
Sure. Well, it sounds like I'm not a family therapist, so it sounds like you might need some intervention there. But I can at least connect you with some resources. So I would get in touch with local service foresters. So the Division of Wildlife has some private lands biologists, and also the Division of Forestry. You can message us as well, and we can connect you with those folks. Also, soil and water conservation districts might be able to help you find additional supports and programs to help you manage that habitat, both through financial and logistic resources. But as for any siblings, sorry, I don't know how much help I can do there.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for answering all the questions as we were going too. That was great. I don't know, maybe we should go, should we go into the next, and we can just continue to continue to encourage folks to ask questions to Brad in the Q&A section there.
Yeah,
get those answers, and we can always come back to them. That sounds good.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Great.
Sound. All right, you all seen that? All right. Okay, so yeah, Steve and I wanted to give you a little bit of background and context into why and how some of those birds make these big movements across the landscape, and why we may only see some of those species for very short periods of time. And then I wanted to go through, since we're kind of just getting into the hot seat here of migration, talk about what species are coming through at particular times. And depending on your taxonomic group of interest, you're either hitting the end of that if it's waterfowl, or you're just starting to get excited if it's all of those warbler species that Brad just went through. And so, one thing we need to think about is why are these birds moving across the landscape, and what are the reasons why they're making these big movements? For the longest time, we thought of all of these birds as our birds, and then they just go on a winter vacation for a while. But as we talked about with some of the early successional habitat use, it's not just during the breeding season. Some of these species that nest in mature forest move into some of those early successional habitats at different times of the year. So these life cycles are pretty complex, and it turns out that birds are moving around on the landscape quite a bit. And we're getting better and better understanding of that through citizen science data or community science data. And eBird has been just a phenomenal tool. So I think in every presentation that I am a part of, I usually give at least some sort of pitch for eBird. And so I'll talk about it a little bit more today, but it's a great resource. If you aren't using eBird, if you're not contributing observations, it's at least a really great resource to find out where birds are and when they're showing up. And so what we're looking at here is actually a relative abundance map generated weekly for observations of Magnolia Warbler. And you can see that they're actually spending quite a bit of time overwintering in the Yucatan Peninsula. And then they're making this quick movement during the spring up through the Appalachians. And a lot of boreal breeding birds, even those that nest in Western North America, come up through the Appalachians because of that broadleaf green forest and all the food resources that are available during the spring. And so you can see they're making a pretty quick movement. We don't have many actually stick around here during the breeding season in Ohio. Most of them are going farther north into Canada. But eBird has a ton of these maps now available. I could stare at these images for hours. I'll try not to dwell on the Magnolia Warbler here too long, but I encourage you to go to ebird.org and click on the science tab to see more of these. Migration is pretty daunting. It's a dangerous journey. And we wonder, why do birds go to put themselves at this risk in order to make these fast movements. And it's really to maximize their reproductive success. You know, they're concentrated in pretty, sometimes very high numbers while they're overwintering in Central and South America. That's because there are no food resources available in some of those temperate and boreal regions. But as you can see from another one of these fantastic animated images, you know, North America greens up quite a bit and is just abundant with food resources during the spring and summer. And so birds are sort of spreading out to take advantage of those resources at different times of the year. So I'll pass this over to Steve now. Let's talk a little bit about some of the research that we're doing.
Great, thanks. If Matt, if you could just go back one slide really quickly.
Yep.
It's just, I also just to add to one of the questions that we had earlier that you answered, you know, this question about, you know, as climate changes, you know, earlier and how the species respond. And I think your answer was really great in terms of, you know, the challenge of untangling this, but it gives you a sense, you know, just, you know, kind of thinking about this figure, you know, earlier blooming times, differential emergence of invertebrate insects, you know, which are the primary kind of engine for a lot of these birds in terms of breeding. And then also these signals that species kind of have differently. So a bird in South America is not necessarily sensing the change in earlier spring as others. So this mismatch in timing is really critical part to that. So this whole underlying process of why birds migrate is tied to reproductive success, as Matt says. And that's a really important kind of seasonal link we have there. And so, you know, this is one aspect that we think about why birds are migrating, you know, to take advantage of that and maximize their reproductive success, and, you know, how things can get disrupted and how these happen across continents. So just to add that there. So if I guess you can go ahead to the next slide for me there, that'd be awesome. And so basically to do this, you know, we want to talk about, you know, why birds are migrating so that we get a sense for that, and then, you know, where they're going. So again, just kind of re-emphasizing the importance of this, you know, full annual cycle view. And this is just one, you know, small example. There's lots of papers out there, and I just put it there because it was research that we did, you know, kind of originated at Furness. And so typically if we would have been in the woods today, we could have gone and seen some of these sites. But, you know, Eastern, you know, whippoorwill is a great example of a species we didn't know a lot about in terms of where they were going once they left the breeding grounds. We really don't know much about what they're doing on the breeding grounds. For that matter, they use early successional type habitats and mix of forests. And so we were able to put on these archival GPS tags, and then essentially each of these lines tracks those birds as they move down to their breeding grounds, and then overwintered. Many of the birds overwintering in southern Mexico in this case, and we were able to then quantify what their winter habitat uses were like. So, you know, these varying ranges in home range sizes, still using forests and forest edges, but slightly different habitats than they would use on the breeding grounds. But, you know, just looking at this figure, just think about how migration is occurring and linking these habitats and all the different decisions that birds are making. So that just gives you a little sense, you know, for why it's understanding of how birds are moving across the landscape during migration. So when we see them in our backyards, they're undergoing these really large trips. And as you notice here, many of these whippoorwills all of them are not crossing the Gulf of Mexico, right? So they're making decisions along the way. So if you can go ahead to the next slide, Matt. And so that's where we wanted to just give you a little sense for what is going on in terms of how birds are making these amazing migratory movements, you know, twice a year. Really taking up a lot of the year. And a couple of key things just to be thinking about, and hopefully, you know, looking at the great pictures from Brad and thinking about the ideas, giving you this idea that, you know, there's a lot going on out in the woods. And so as you think about that, you know, kind of think about what's happening for those individual birds, and how are they making these trips from South America to Canada and Alaska? They need fuel, right, to really do this. And this is coming from this figure just from a research that we had done. Brian Dossman was a graduate student a couple of years ago, and he actually was able to look at and study American redstarts that were in different energetic conditions. So birds that had a lot of fuel reserves versus birds that had fewer fuel reserves. And what he found was that birds that were in poorer condition had to stay over on these stopover sites longer. This is along Lake Erie. So what I'm trying to get at here is that stopover habitats are really critical for birds that are able to make these migratory movements. So stopover habitats have to provide both food resources and cover for them to replenish their fuels. In some cases, replenishing a large portion of their overall body weight in just a couple of days or a week in order to make that next big jump. And so if you add up all the time on migration, they really spend more than seven times the amount of time actually on the ground trying to refuel and rest so they can make that next migratory flight. And again, many of these birds are flying at night and then landing and having to refuel. And so they can fly a couple hundred kilometers in a night. And so that's why it's really important that, to maintain, being able to get energy so you can keep on the migratory schedule, because other kind of research shows if birds get delayed during migration, it can have this huge reproductive cost, as we kind of had in the other slide. If you kind of are arriving later, you can lose an egg or two a year, right? And that doesn't sound like a lot, but these birds only living a couple of years, and that can really affect their overall lifetime reproductive success. So it's a really important aspect here. So I guess we go ahead to the next slide here, Matt. And so this schematic from this older paper kind of really, in my mind, captures, what's going on throughout the stopover migratory journey and this kind of repeated stopover events, over land, and then an occasional kind of flying over these migratory barriers. And so kind of balancing this energy is a really important part. How are you kind of getting to the breeding grounds as fast as possible, but not being so risky that you're kind of depleting your energy resources. So it's this kind of mix between getting there faster and making sure you have energy. And that's why stopover habitat, when we're seeing these birds during migration, is really such a critical piece. We're observing them, they're flying around foraging, but it's really pretty amazing. You think about the journey these birds are going under. So if you go ahead to the next slide there, Matt. And so that's why just kind of really making sure it's important we understand the importance of conserving and having stopover habitat. In this case, forest patches in different successional stages, because birds use them. But just because birds aren't using them year round, right, these few weeks and months that they're using them during migration can be really important. So we have to think about what's going on throughout the full annual cycle of these birds. And some birds are breeding there, like cerulean warblers and hooded warblers and all these oven birds. We want to make sure there's breeding habitat, but we also want to have habitat for magnolia warblers and blackpoll warblers as they're kind of moving through. And so birds are making these decisions. You can think about a bird flying at night. Each night when it's flying, it has to decide, where am I going to land? And there's some sort of habitat selection that's going on there that's really important. And then once they're landing there, they have to assess, how much food can I get here, right? Is the weather okay for me to fly again? And so these decisions are really critical. And that's why understanding the importance of stopover habitat is a really important aspect of bird conservation. So this is just, think about in terms of the patch sizes of our forests that we have within Ohio, and birds are kind of moving across this landscape, as that image that Matt showed of Magnolia Warbler. So kind of thinking about where they're stopping over. And Matt, the next slide, I think that'll be the last one, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I just want to add something real quick before we go on to the next one. I think Mary's question was really timely. So thinking about, you can't see a lot of the forest patches on this map so well in northwestern Ohio, but those tiny little forest patches, as Steve was getting at, are critically important. So if you have some property that you manage in this portion of the state, northwestern Ohio, providing some of that stopover habitat, whether it's leaving fence rows wooded and buffered, and having small woodlots, or some sort of early successional habitat or cover, whether it's CRP, anything helps. And the more of that we can have in this type of landscape, because this is where a lot of species, as they're coming up through the Appalachians, once they hit Ohio, they really start to fan out, and some are going more western, and so they're coming across this landscape. So if you can make any contributions to providing cover and habitat, and you live in this area, it's a great opportunity to do so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so good. I mean, that really kind of ties in nicely to thinking about this. What is breeding habitat? You may say could be too small, you're worried about, but for stopover, it can be really, really critical. And so these are just two more examples from other research that we've done, within Ohio. One was really, kind of looking at Swainson's thrush, and really this component of finding that this pressure for birds to migrate and get to the breeding grounds is really strong. And we actually see that is really kind of a driver in them making their decisions. They really only are staying in the stopover sites for a couple of days, refueling as much as they can, and then moving on. And this didn't matter. This was a study that was done within Columbus or in the urban patches, and the size of the patch didn't necessarily matter. Birds were able to refuel kind of and move around in similar ways, and then move on to the next stopover site. So it's really interesting to think about the decisions that they're making and the importance of these stopover habitats from the Swainson's thrush study. And then the other study along Lake Erie, just to, again, highlight the important critical habitat area that this provides for birds during migration. So this study was with murder warblers and American medstarts. It really shows the importance that this site has in terms of for birds to really refuel before they kind of get to where they're going in terms of breeding grounds. And we really saw this really strong signal of birds in poor condition had to stay longer in order to put out fuel reserves to make that next jump. Whereas those birds that were heavier, right, they only had to stay for 3 days and they would make their next jump. And it was really interesting. It didn't matter whether we were on this south side of Lake Erie or on the north side in Canada, they stayed around the same amount of time. So it really kind of gets this component of these birds are in a hurry, but they have to take care of themselves and be in good condition before they arrive in the breeding ground. So next time you're out and you're thinking about all these birds moving across the landscape, and that's going to talk about the timing, think about the journeys that they're making and the types of decisions that are kind of going on in order to keep that migration speed kind of unfolding. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you so you can give us some more.
Great. So yeah, I just wanted to go through and talk about what groups of species or individual species might be coming through across spring. So I've generalized this a bit for central Ohio, maybe with a skew towards southeastern Ohio, but just keep in mind that if you are in the northern part of the state, some of these might seem a little on the early side. And if you're way down in the very southern portion of the state, you're maybe way ahead of us already. But I wanted to go through here and talk about these from really what I consider the start in about mid-February up through the very end of spring migration. And so for me, the real sign of spring is when these blackbirds are starting to show up. And I think that Redwing Blackbird, and I saw that this really came out in the poll as being a favorite for a lot of people, is really the harbinger of spring for me. And you can see in this photo here that it's still pretty wintry in the backdrop, but these birds show up by mid-February and start staking out territories. It's around this time too that American woodcock starts showing up, and waterfowl migration is really starting to kick off. As we get into March, waterfowl migration really starts to pick up. And then some of our, our returning typical spring birds start to show up. We start seeing movements of yellow-bellied sapsucker and eastern phoebe. So I've starred these species because depending on where you're at in the States, you may actually get them throughout the winter. We're at the northern extent of the wintering range for these species as well. So some of you in southeastern Ohio might have eastern phoebes that you're able to find throughout the winter. Same for yellow-bellied sapsuckers. But you'll likely start seeing more movements of them during this March time period. And tree swallows are usually showing up by early to mid-March as well. And so, I split my time between Columbus and Vinton County. I'm here in Columbus today, just so that I can take advantage of internet, which I don't really have great internet in Vinton County. But I thought it would be fun to show you, give you a little snapshot of what I've seen in my yard in Vinton County so far this year. So I started seeing movements of yellow-bellied sapsuckers by mid-February. And eastern phoebe, we have one that nests above our kitchen window, was already checking out that nest site by February 13th. And so, we get eastern phoebes reported throughout Vinton County during the winter time. But it was interesting to see this bird back and scoping out the nest site and already starting to build a nest by late February. As of this past week, I think nest construction is complete at that spot. So by mid-March, waterfowl are really at peak migration. If you are familiar with the Shreve area, they typically have a birding festival called Shreve Migration Sensation. I encourage you, once we get back to birding festivals and birding in groups, to check that out at some point. It's a really fantastic place to go see waterfowl and cranes and lots of larger birds moving. Mid-March is about the time when raptor migration is starting to pick up. And by this time, American woodcock are already very territorial. Some of them, may have copulated early in the season, late in February, but by this time, most of the woodcock should be back in parts of the state. Most of the swallows and purple martins are also back by mid-March or late March as well. So I had American woodcock at my place on territory by March 3rd. So, they're back pretty early, and I know Cleveland is getting lots of woodcock moving through right now. So they're pretty much everywhere in Ohio by now. And if you haven't seen woodcock, Steve, are you hearing audio? Okay. No?
We forgot to share the audio when you shared the screen.
Here we go. Restart that over again.
There you go. Yep.
Okay. So these guys are so much fun. And so if you don't have some field or early successional habitats near you, and a lot of the metro parks do American woodcock walks during March. So I encourage you to check them out. The males will peent and sort of prance around and then fly straight up into the air and tumble down. And their feathers make this really funny whistling noise as they're falling down. But this is a lot of fun to do, to get out in March, to get you excited for migration, to watch these guys. It's just so silly. If you pay close attention, you can actually see, it looks like his bill bends open, kind of splays out. Their beaks are really flexible because they're probing into the ground for earthworms and other insects down into the mud. And there he goes. So yeah, they're still doing that now as we get into early to mid-April, but that will start to slow down a little bit as we get later on in the month. All right, so that brings us up until about the current time now. So late March to early April, waterfowl migration is still kicking strong. Raptor migration is hitting peak, and shorebird migration is beginning. Shorebird migration, as you'll see over the course of the next several slides, is really prolonged. And so, I encourage you to get out, check out wet fields in your area during this time, because it's really great. You can see flocks of American golden plover, like photographed here, and other shorebirds. Especially if you're in northwestern Ohio, getting out to some of those flooded farm fields around the marshes can just be fantastic for viewing shorebirds. Sapsuckers, kinglets, winter wren, all starting to move through. And it's by this time that we're starting to get those exciting warblers back that Brad talked about. Louisiana water thrush is the earliest kind of arrival. I had one at our typical spots by March 23rd, came back. I think that was 5 days earlier this year compared to the previous year. And yellow-throated warbler was back by the end of March. Kinglets, we get kinglets throughout the winter at times, but I started seeing movements in ruby crown kinglets showing up by the end of March. And so we're just starting to get a lot of these species back in some numbers now. And now, from here forward, these are all the things that you have to look forward to. So start taking notes, thinking about some of those species that you want to see. And we can talk about, keep in mind some of the habitats that Brad talked about for some of those warblers. And we can talk about some of these other groups as well. I usually get questions this time of year about people seeing larger numbers of great egrets, either in their ponds or local marshes or flying overhead, and wondering if they're new nesting species. they're transient migrants at this point. So a lot of the great egrets and even great blue herons are starting to sort of pass through southern Ohio and other parts of the state. And they're starting to show some of that breeding plumage. You can just see a little bit of it here. This great egret photograph is starting to get that green coloration around the eye. And some of the plumes on the back are starting to grow out as well. So they're really fun birds to see moving. I had some herons fly over my yard yesterday. We don't have any ponds big enough for great blue heron in the near vicinity. So I know those were migrants. Warblers are really starting to arrive like right now. I've been in Columbus the past couple of days, but I saw on the Athens area birders listserv that folks are seeing black and white warbler, palm warbler, and I think there was even a report of Nashville Warbler. So, there you have it. By mid-April, these birds are starting to show up. Blue-gray gnatcatcher, these tiny little sprites, they make this very soft call. It's like sort of twee, twee. They're back now as well. And we're starting to get more movements of sparrows come through. I had my first blue-gray gnatcatcher just 5 days ago in Vinton County. And I think there are reports of gnatcatchers in central Ohio and even some northern areas as well. So you have to train your ears to pick up on those little fellows. Okay, as we get later into April, things are going to get somewhat exciting and chaotic. We can get large movements of warblers and thrushes, and even have mornings that folks refer to as fallout, where there's just been big movements of nocturnal migrants, and they're stopping over in the morning to fuel up those fat reserves again. Hummingbirds will start to show up late in the month. We should start hearing house wrens at this time as well. And it's typically that last week of April that we start getting decent movements of species like Swainson's thrush and some of these other species as well. So it's going to get very colorful. As the trees green up, we're going to start seeing lots of little dots of color adorn them, like little ornaments. By mid-May, this is typically right after the biggest week in American birding. So if you've ever gone up to northwestern Ohio during this time period, the biggest week is a great time to go. But I encourage folks who maybe aren't as excited about large crowds of people that it's still pretty awesome to go there after the biggest week, because there's still a lot of movement. And in some cases, some of these birds aren't coming through until after the biggest week. Like willow flycatcher is a species we really don't get many individuals of during that time period. And blackpoll warbler as well. They're a little bit on the later end. They can start showing up in southern Ohio, maybe like the last week of April, but really not getting a push of those until later in mid-May. Migration is still going pretty strong into late May and even into June. The cuckoos especially, yellow-billed cuckoo and black-billed cuckoo can have very prolonged migration, and we can still have transient migrants coming through into the first and sometimes even second week of June. Indigo bunting and Lincoln sparrow are species that really don't come through until about the end of May, sometimes into June. Bunting is one that I'm sure people get really excited about. It's fairly widespread and common and super colorful. But I encourage you to look for those little Lincoln sparrows as well. They're a little bit more cryptic colored, but really pretty sparrows. And I saw that Brad is putting together a sparrow presentation for the future. So that will be interesting. There's a lot more brown and gray to discuss compared to yellow and green and orange. So that's a really fun sparrow that comes through late during the migratory period. And so, a lot of this is, this calendar is based on, my experience in the area, but you can get a lot of this information just by mining eBird. So I talked a lot about that. You've probably heard a lot about eBird in terms of contributing your observations. And, if you're up to it, I encourage you to contribute your observations to eBird as well. But it's also a really great tool to use to learn about birds, to learn when birds are coming through, and to even explore things like songs and calls and photographs. We had a lot of questions during Brad's presentation about where to go to get audio recordings of birds. You can get a lot of that through eBird just by using this explore species function. And you can also explore regions. Here I was, this is from a slide that I was given for the Union County Bird Club. And I was just showing them that, you can pull up data in these bar charts for any particular area, whether it's a hotspot or if it's a county. And so here I pulled up a bar chart of all the species that have ever been observed in Union County. And you can see when they start to show up, when they disappear, when they're most abundant. So if you want to learn about when the birds really come back in your area, eBird is a really great resource to do that. So I know that that was a pretty quick overview of migration, but as you'll find out, things happen really, really quickly here over the next couple of weeks. It's going to get very exciting. So I saw there were a lot of questions in chat coming up, and so I wasn't able to keep up with that. But if there are any other lingering questions, I'd be happy to talk about some of those. So I see the calendar of timing question here from Patty. So I think Dave is going to make these slides available on his website, and I'll let Dave confirm that.
Yes, I will. I'll make this and the resources that Brad mentioned about some of his other presentations available. It'll take a little while to get this rendered, and kind of dependent on someone else to get it on YouTube, which is, I think, the best way for people to see it. But I'll post all that probably next week as soon as I can get it done.
In the meantime, I do encourage you to go to ebird.org and click on the Explore tab, and then you can filter that calendar for your county to find out when birds are starting to show back up.
Matt, I did see one question on there. Somebody asked about what is the effect of wind turbines on birds migrating through Ohio?
That's a really great question, and we're a lot of people trying to understand that. So I will state as a caveat in the beginning, it is really important that we look towards cleaner sources of energy, but siting for these is really important in understanding the impacts. Just because the carbon footprint might be lower doesn't mean it's necessarily a green source of energy. And so, the Western Lake Erie Basin and Lake Erie in general is a globally important migratory stopover area. For some species, much of their wintering population is isolated to this region. Most of the world's red breasted mergansers, for instance, overwinter on Lake Erie. So wind production on Lake Erie could be fairly detrimental if it's not researched and cited properly. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to the solution, but it's really important that there's a lot of transparency and research involved that sort of informs where any source of energy development is placed and expanded on the landscape.
While we're doing the question and answer, I went ahead and put the QR code, and we'll just, if you folks want to participate in that poll again, you're welcome to do it. I'm also putting the poll in the chat window again. So just curious if anybody's favorite birds changed after the presentation. Sorry about the interruption. Anything in chat we've missed, guys?
I'm kind of scrolling back through now.
I feel like we've gotten most of it.
Yeah, lots of good comments and
Yeah.
suggestions for resources and places to go. Irwin Prairie State Nature Preserve, yeah, that's great for woodcock. Also really great for snipe and other shorebirds because those sort of wet prairies they have. So one really good ecological question here, Patty had: in the summer, does food source decline in tropical winter ranges for them to come up north? Well, that varies regionally. I will say that's not for the most part, the main driver. Competition is really fierce on the overwintering grounds. A lot of birds are concentrated in this area because there aren't food resources available elsewhere. And then sometimes the competition is so fierce that females may be sort of relegated to poor quality habitat. There's some age discrimination as well. Territoriality can be really high. So really they're expanding to take advantage of more widespread and abundant food resources. There is a lot of seasonal variability in overwintering, and we're learning more and more about overwintering of some of these species. If you go back and look at a lot of field guides and you look at winter ranges for birds, you're going to see a massive blob for many of these species over South America. But we're finding that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes they're very restricted, and sometimes they're restricted to different portions of the wintering range at different times of the year. Veery is a great example. They start off the winter in southern Brazil, and with seasonal droughts, they move towards the northern part of the Amazon basin and parts of northern South America. And so food changes constantly, and that's why these birds are moving around on the landscape quite a bit throughout the year.
Yeah, they have such different patterns too, like in competition with residents too. I mean, you think about this general pattern of the number of eggs laid as you move from the tropics to the temperate region. It varies so dramatically, and in part it has to do with that competition dimension of it. Breeding throughout the year, laying an egg at a time. And take the whippoorwill example. I mean, you know how loud they are. Anyone on the call here, but when you go into the wintering grounds in Mexico, it's hard to find them because they're in such competition with resident other nightjars that they don't see them, and so they're moving around trying to find space. And so this real strong pressure of the number of species and niches and how it changes with precipitation and land use is really critical.
Yeah. So Jeffrey has a good question here. Should I feed birds all summer or let them find other food and start again in October? And I will say, as a general rule of thumb, you feed birds for your benefit, not necessarily the birds' benefit. And so you could put some food out during the summertime, but that's mostly if you want to see some of those species, come close. It's not something they necessarily need. And for many of these species, they're not actually using seed sources at that time anyway. So you will probably only get things like finches continuing to come in. Whenever you do feed, and as much as you feed, always keep your feeders clean. So cleaning your feeders at least once a week to make sure that you're not spreading any disease. And always watch out for mesopredators. Make sure you're keeping your cats indoors. And if you're seeing things like raccoons or other predators around your yard where you're feeding, it would probably be best to stop feeding. So in general, feeding birds is for you. Although it can't help birds, especially in severe winter. Think about Carolina wren and some other species. But good question.
Earlier on, I put a link to OBCI's website, but do you want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are there as far as, especially if you own woodlands or property in Ohio, and how you might be able to manage some of that habitat? Yeah,
that's a good question. And Jennifer looks like she asked a related question in the Q&A section here that I think I can kind of answer in one fell swoop. So yeah, forests are really important. As a general rule of thumb, diversity in species and structure is really great to have. And so we have a lot of those resources on the OBCI website. So if you go to obcinet.org, we have different workshops and guides for forest and landowners, depending on where you live in the state. So as a general rule of thumb, diversity is great. Native plants, as much as you can, put those in. Oaks and cherries and some other species that are native are really great. We talked about a lot of warblers today, and they're using caterpillars during migration. And oaks and cherries are really high in lepidopteran diversity. And so the more that you can have a diversity of native trees and shrubs in your yard or your forest land, that's the best really for birds. So untidy native yards are excellent. In terms of space, anything that you can provide is good. You know, we talked about these birds are stopping over, so having some sort of cover across the entire landscape is really important. So whatever you have to contribute can be good. Dave, Roberto wants to know if folks attending today will get an email letting them know when slides and videos have been posted.
We can do that, yes. I have a list of everybody that attended and everybody that registered, so we certainly can do that. Anything else folks need to do to wrap up? I'd like to thank Brad, Steve, and Matt for an excellent presentation. The photos and the graphics are phenomenal. We had a great turnout today. The numbers are starting to drop off. We've been on for an hour and 45 minutes now. So really appreciate everybody participating, and especially all the hard work that you folks put in to put this beautiful presentation together. I think we've got all the questions answered that I can see.
There's one here that's important. Jeffrey asked about, he's got bluebird boxes up and wants to keep wrens out of them. And he's heard people say to pull their nests. I would just say that wrens are native and protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and it is a felony to remove or damage their nests. And so really it comes down to managing the habitat and where you're placing that nest box. The closer you get it to the wood line, if you have a lot of trees and shrubs around, the more likely that you are to get the Carolina and house wren. So if you get it out into those fields a little bit more and really manage the habitat, you're more likely to get the swallows and bluebirds that you might be targeting. But wrens are great too. They need nest boxes, and chickadees and nuthatches, they all need nest boxes. So enjoy them while they're using your box.
Looks like Redwing Blackbird's still winning when it comes to favorite bird for a lot of folks. I think because it means spring's just around the corner, maybe. All right, thanks everybody. I think we'll call it a wrap. And again, I will email folks when we get not only the recording for today, but some of the resources that have been mentioned. I'll have the speakers email those to me and I'll attach those all to one post so you'll have that available. Thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yep.
Try to spend a good part of it out there in the woods.
Yeah, happy birding.
Dave, thanks for hosting this. Matt and Steve, thanks for
You're welcome.
everything you guys did. It was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Stop the recording.